from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
On today's North Idaho College Public Forum, we're pleased to welcome two guests to discuss one of our favorite topics, and that is world travel. All the years that we've been doing this program, we have discovered that this is one of your most popular topics, and we get wonderful reaction. We have two veterans back that have been with us on several occasions because they travel around the world, and they're so gracious and cooperative with their time when they return. I welcome to the program two friends from many years. First of all is Judy Meyer and her spouse Steve Meyer, who are the owners of Parkwood Properties in Kootenai County, Idaho, which is a large rental company. And they take off time occasionally to go with their sons and travel to different parts of the world. On this particular occasion, they have recently been to Ecuador and have returned to talk to us about that trip. Judy and Steve, we welcome you to the program, and it's always a delight to have you here. And as always, I'm very pleased to have our two regular panel members. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College. And I'm going to change format a little bit, as we always do when Judy and Steve are with us, and I'm going to usurp the position that Janelle usually takes. Judy and I always go through a map at the beginning to let our viewers know about the country and the surrounding countries, and I'm going to invite Judy at this time to show us where they went. And Judy, I know that you would like to give us some demographics of the country of Ecuador.
Okie doke, Tony. Let me put up a map here so that we can get oriented a little bit, because whenever we go on a journey, we need to be sure we know where we're going. In this case, we had some fun family discussions about just where is Ecuador, and it didn't take long. We knew it was in South America to discover it was one of the smallest countries in South America, here on the Pacific coast. What was fun in our family discussion was, what large American city would we know is due north of Ecuador? And one of the first reactions would be Los Angeles or something in the west. But in actuality, and we don't have a top of the map to clarify where North America is right above it, probably one of the cities we would know that's north of Ecuador is Buffalo, New York, or Miami. So that was our route then to fly to Ecuador through Miami and into the capital city of Quito, which you see here is a little bit in the northern section of Ecuador. Ecuador is Ecuador because it's on the equator, which runs right through this section of South America. In addition to visiting the main section of Ecuador, we spent a week traveling out to the Galapagos Islands, about 600 miles to the west in the Pacific Ocean. We'll talk more about that section of the trip later. What I want to do to orient us here is to see that Colombia is north of Ecuador. That is not particularly politically stable, and we did not even travel near that border area. It's not recommended to do so. We traveled down the Andes Mountains, so we were at about 9,000 feet during part of that time. And then we also went to the east of the Andes to the tributary of the headwaters of the Amazon, and there's the Amazon River as it goes all the way across South America. Does that get us started?
That did. I just have one follow-up question.
Sure.
That has a little bit to do with the country as we look at it, and we do see it's small in comparison with some of the other countries. Can you give us, again, some comparison with what size it would be and a little bit about the population and climate?
Sure, good thought. Ecuador is about the size of Nevada. It has about 10 million people in it, of various compositions, indigenous folk, the Spanish who conquered it, lots of visitors like us. Tourism is a good thing to happen to Ecuador. They are politically stable enough that it's a fun place to visit. The natives are very friendly and eager to have us visiting there. The climate is a mixture, and that's another part of the fun visit. The mountains in the Andes, at the tallest peak is 20,000 feet, has snow-capped peak on the Ecuador, all the way down to sea level on the ocean. The climate is mild year-round. Since it's on the equator, it's warm from all the seasons, and daylight from 6 in the morning till 6 at night. Did I cover all the things?
And the population?
Population, 10 million,
okay.
10 million people.
Janelle Burke.
One of the interesting things about the topography is that the top of the highest mountain in Ecuador is farther away from the center of the planet than any other place in the world. farther than the top of Mount Everest, because the Earth has a little bulge at the equator, and so therefore these 20,000-foot peaks are in fact the tallest thing in the planet.
That is most interesting. Janelle Burke.
Steve, can you tell us, why did you choose to go to Ecuador? How did you happen to go there?
We like to float whitewater rivers, and the reason was to find another river, or like climbing mountains, another mountain to float. Our oldest son has been a whitewater river guide for a number of years for a Coeur d'Alene company named River Odysseys West, called ROW, R-O-W. And ROW is just starting a expedition on the Yupano River, which is on the east side of the Andes and runs from a glacier called Sangay down toward the Atlantic Ocean. And we went to float down the Yupano River. On part of the river, we were the first commercial trip. It had been pioneered 2 trips or 3 trips earlier this year and 2 trips last year. ROW is the only firm in Ecuador running multiple-day river float trips. Our son is a senior in college, and we felt this was an opportunity where our whole family could get together with his younger brother, kind of the last hurrah where the boys had a college Christmas season vacation together, and we've had the good fortune to travel a lot as a family, and so this was too good an opportunity to pass up. And so Andy went as a boatman, or a boat pilot, if you will, and rode. We were only able to ride, or we were the only ones able to ride with him. Other guests rode with other people. And so we went for the expedition of the river experience, a 5-day trip, and then we spent about a week in the highlands, valleys of 9,000 feet in between 18 to 20,000 foot volcanoes. And then we were able to spend a week in the Galapagos Islands, learning about Darwin and evolution.
Well, tell me something about this river. I take it it's a tributary down to the Amazon eventually. The water there will eventually end up in the Amazon. Can you tell me something about what kind of river it is? Is it slow moving? Is it jungly? Is it all of those things?
It's jungly and very sensitive to the rain. While the river is big enough year-round to run because it comes from a glacier, and it's hard to imagine glaciers on the equator, but the river surprised us in that it was very rocky, great big rock bars, because the high water might be 15 or 20 feet higher than the level where it was when we ran it. And at high water, at the put-in, the river might have been 200 feet wide. At the level where we started, it was maybe 60 feet wide. And one of the things you have to be careful about, because the weather changes so rapidly, is if it's raining in some valley that you can't see, why that night the water level will come up, depending on how far downstream from the rainstorm you are. So the guides were real sensitive about rain and water levels. The float trip itself is in the Amazon jungle. We dropped about 2,000 feet, Judy, I would say, in 80 miles of river travel. From where we took out, we were only at elevation of 2,000 feet. So the next 3,000 miles to the Atlantic Ocean, to the east, the river only falls a couple of thousand feet, so it's very flat. And that kind of came as a surprise to me. The Amazon basin, I thought, was kind of a big bowl. Well, in fact, it's really a big plate. It's very flat out in the Amazon basin. The Andes are very sharp, very steep, overthrust, kind of a glacial formation, and they're very steep on the Pacific side, and then the Atlantic side that we were on, maybe in the course of 100 miles, they go from valley floors of 9,000 or 10,000 feet to the 2,000 foot elevations I talked about. Returning from the trip, the road we came over, which is the only road, and
not a superhighway.
Oh, it was a 2-lane road that took 12 hours from the time we got out of the river to get back to the destination for that evening, a town called Cuenca. And the road at the top of the Andes, the pass, was 13,000 feet. So we were pretty high for us.
Steve Shink.
Judy, I know the Myers are a studious family, and I'm sure you researched this trip thoroughly before you went, but I always like to ask people who go to exotic places. A two-part question. What was most notable in your mind? I mean, what feature about people or place or culture, whatever, really made the biggest impression, and what surprised you the most?
We do research before we go to help us better know what we want to look for. And in our family, running the river and where there are Class 3 rapids is fun because those rapids are a size that has some challenge to it. So that part of it was intriguing to our sons. For me, probably the indigenous people is something I'm interested in, and we all were. They were just as friendly and hospitable as I had hoped and expected. When we were on the river part of the trip, we were in the Shuar Indian area, which is very remote. There was only one crossing of the river with a road. There was no electricity in the area until about 40 or 50 miles after we left the river. The Indians were interested in seeing us. Many of them had not seen a river raft before. One of the fun scenes was when we had 4 river rafts and a kayaker. And the kayaker in a kayak is, of course, rather close to the water and not very significant. The native folk are very short, and so most of us feel very big and clumsy around them. And when the kayaker brought his kayak to shore, the Indians were glad to come up to him because he was quite short. And in fact, they were taller than he was, one of the few times when that would occur. But the kayaker actually was 6'5", and so when he stood up in his kayak, it was quite a scene as these natives began to see this fellow unfold. And they stepped away, and some of the children were intimidated. They had never seen anybody with a beard and a helmet, 6'5". That's impressive. So that was one of the fun things we saw.
And what really seemed out of sync to you? What was the one thing that you said, gosh, I didn't expect that?
I would say, and our whole family commented, that the Amazon was not as jungly as we thought it would be. And that's because this river with the rapids, although it's not been commercially traveled because the rapids prohibit that sort of thing, the natives have had to adapt to an economy where you need money and cash, and the way to get that is to clear the jungle and grow products or raise cattle in the beef industry. We were not in an area of Ecuador where the oil exploration is going on. That would be that place I would expect to have the collision of economic needs and the roads that are being built and the destruction of the jungle there. But here along a river, which has not ever been developed very much, still there were only a few places in some lovely canyons where there was really jungle. The vines are hanging down, the butterflies are flapping, and the butterflies are as big as a plate. They're just beautiful, and the birds are chirping. There are no monkeys along the river as we had expected and hoped because they've all been harvested. When the Indians are colonized, they get guns, so they went from the blowgun to a rifle, and you can certainly harvest a lot more monkeys a lot more quickly. And so when we visited with some native folks in the villages, they said we have to now walk 2 days to harvest a monkey. So those are some of the differences we saw.
Before the show, we talked about how you divide this up. Again, it was very wise. You had almost 3 weeks and had a week in each section after you had floated the river and had come back. Take us through the second period and the kind of experiences that you had.
Where do we begin? The city of Cuenca is where, when we came out of the river, we came to the city of Cuenca, the second largest city, a lovely city. It has more colonial architecture than the capital city of Quito, and it's a smaller town. Coincidentally, when there was a conference here last fall of the International Women's Conference, one of the attendees was from the city of Cuenca. She stayed with us, and we reconnected with her when we were visiting in Cuenca. She's active in the women's issues and social health issues there. So we had a fun dinner in Cuenca. From there, then we traveled by van along this Avenue of the Volcanoes, it's called, back up towards Quito, and did some sightseeing there of the various native indigenous folks with very colorful costumes. We really enjoyed that part of it. I better let you tell us what you enjoyed. The train ride.
Yeah, the train ride. One of the things that we find particularly interesting in third world places is the railroads that the Europeans, particularly the British, built. And when we spoke to you before about Africa or Thailand, we've talked to you about train trips. In Ecuador, why it turns out it was the Spanish and the Americans who built the railway, but there's a narrow gauge railway that goes from the coast up to the mountains and then up and down this valley. The railway to get up to 9,000 feet is on it. They weren't able to go in conventional fashion up a gentle grade. They just picked a very steep mountain, which is called the devil's nose, and the rail line switchbacks back and forth up the mountain. But it's not a switchback like you think of as the road to Schweitzer or the old
Lewiston Hill.
Lewiston Hill. There's no room for the train to turn, and so it goes up forward a ways and then backs up the next pitch and then goes forward and then backs up the next pitch, and it goes back and forth in that fashion. Part of that railway has been destroyed by a big storm a couple of years ago, and there's part of it still functioning. Old British equipment. So one time our group divided, and our son Andy and I were the railway buffs, and we wanted to ride the train, and so we were left at the station.
Riobamba.
In Riobamba, that's right.
And
Riobamba is an
what'd you
overnight
pay for
place.
the train ticket?
And the ticket to Quito, which is an all-day ride, cost 60 cents, I think,
About
or
that.
$1.20 for two of us, and that was first class. And the first class car was a wooden car with wooden seats and wooden
Windows that open,
slide-up
that's right.
windows, wonderful windows that you can really open and hang your head out. The second class car, which is right in front of us, had simply benches, looked more like a boxcar, and there were travelers in it as well. And then there was a freight car at the front of the train, and an electric locomotive, a brand new electric locomotive. And I believe before this electric locomotive, it was a steam railway. We saw some steam engines there. But the highlight of that was the discovery that the locals find the most fun place to travel is on top of the train. And our sons, when we saw that, I said, being kind of conservative, I guess,
Come on, Dad.
you might fall off. We would be careful. And pretty soon we noticed nobody was falling off, and they all were smiling and laughing. And so soon, when the train stopped at the station, we climbed onto the top of the car and rode for a couple of hours through a couple of rainstorms. And we had little Peruvian wool hats with flaps over ears. We pulled those down tight. And
What'd you hang on to?
there was a walkway on the top of the car, and I sat on the walkway and in the beginning held on with both hands. There were others. There was also a little rod down to the edge of the car, and there were young people who were just sprawled out on the roof, and the car was rocking back and forth because the right-of-way was rough, and nobody fell off.
Including you.
Including us. But the view is magnificent because you look all around and the breeze in your face, it's like, you know, a dog in a pickup truck. It's very pleasant. And that was the highlight. We spent a whole afternoon riding along underneath Cotopaxi, which is a large volcanic mountain with snow-capped peak on the top. And we were in the national park that's around Cotopaxi, where it's real green and lots of vegetation. Ecuador is an agricultural country, and so the fields are everywhere. They're usually hand cultivated, not very many tractors.
No, oxen and
Oxen and
plow.
wooden plows, and we saw all of that. We saw a couple of roads paved with cobblestones. I mean, through the countryside, not just in the street, but between community.
Well, the only paved road is a Pan-American highway, which runs north and south up through the country, but otherwise everything else is dirt.
And Highway 95 is better than the Pan-American Highway, so
Oh my
we
goodness,
shouldn't
yes.
complain so much about Highway 95.
I have another issue that I'm going to get into because I don't get another chance when I go back to the panel, I'm sure. Judy has referred earlier to an international conference that took 2.5 years to prepare to come here. It was the fourth in a series of 10 around the world, and I want to also thank Judy for serving for 2.5 years on the steering committee. And these human rights conferences being held are different subjects, and the one here was on empowering women, and you indicated that there was a delegate from Ecuador, and they were from other countries too. And one of your purposes of this trip was to meet up again with her and some other people. Could you take just a little time to tell us about the women's movement in Ecuador and politics and what is happening, and in relation to Colombia and others, that it's a more stable political environment?
Well, I'll do as much as I can, in that when you're visiting you never hear all the stories, but at least it was very fortunate for us to be able to connect with Rocio Palacio, who is a resident there in Cuenca, as well as in Quito. I visited with some various organizations and women's organizations there, and some cooperatives that are intentionally formed by women for women, particularly for the crafts. And as you can see here, I'm sharing one that we picked up when we were there, because the women often are paid such a pittance for what they do, and as it goes out in the marketplace, and the price does increase, but not much of that goes back to the women. So there is a cooperative of women, rural women throughout Ecuador, who are trying to join together and merchandise their products. They're looking for ways to distribute them here in the United States. We talked about that, and various ways of helping increase the economy for Ecuador, because other than oil, which is one of their major exports, and shrimp, bananas, and shrimp, they are beginning to colonize shrimp along the Pacific coastline. And not many of those businesses really include women. So we're back to the crafts. And as you look around in the United States, you will see quite a few Ecuadorian crafts available. The other topic that I visited with many of the women about was domestic violence. And the reason that Rocio was here in Idaho, at Idaho State, was learning about domestic violence programs enough that she could go back and then begin to foster those programs throughout Ecuador. And in a Latin American culture, that is a real dilemma. That the men's perception of women's role is very different than how women would like to be perceived, and it's an ongoing dilemma. There are several projects to begin shelter home sorts of things. There's really no way to finance those. Women do not have control over their own money and cannot have, it's very difficult to start a business. If you're a woman, you need your husband to sign for it. If you're divorced, you are still responsible for their debts, and there's no way you can free yourself of that. So there's many challenges there. We visited with several Peace Corps volunteers who are from the United States, again working with health projects, women and children, the ongoing issue of reproductive rights and domestic violence were needing attention, but also exciting because women are beginning to take hold of those issues.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
Well, Steve, we have to go on now to the islands. We've gone through week 1 with the river, and week 2 with the plains, I guess. Would you say?
Mm-hmm.
And then we're now on the 3rd week. You're going out to the islands, the Galapagos Islands, and can you tell us a little bit about that?
I'd like to. I'd like to return to Tony's question a moment and tell you a story about politics in Ecuador, which I think is a fun story and perhaps a lesson that we can learn in the United States. There are lots of parties, political parties in Ecuador, so many, and they have names like the Christian Democrats and the Social whatever, and so forth. And it's difficult for people to remember the names of the parties, and when there's 18 or 20 candidates, it's also difficult to remember the names of the candidates. So we noticed, and we asked a question about on buildings and bridge abutments and walls and the sides of schools, there were big painted numbers, 6 and 12 and 9 and 24. The system is that every party has a number. And instead of putting up a poster about the name of your party or the name of your candidate, you just get your friend to paint your number on the wall of his home. And it turns out that the successful presidential candidate was number 12. And in fact, we saw a lot of number 12s and a lot of number 8s. I don't know who number 8 was, but he didn't win.
The runner-up, probably.
That's right, maybe. And then to make it even more confusing, the successful new president is named Sixto, S-I-X-T-O. The Ecuadorians are fond of political criticism, and so we heard a lot of complaint, mostly about economic reform, that President Sixto was trying to solve problems of not enough money and too many demands for services, a story we've heard before.
That's familiar.
The Galapagos is probably easier to understand. It's about evolution. We went to the Galapagos. We flew 800 miles out to the Pacific. The Galapagos is an island chain of volcanic origin, 27 islands as I recall. The largest one is about half the land area. The rest of them are quite small. The style of travel there is on a boat. Typically you sleep and eat on the boat and travel between islands, often at night, and get off in various places to look at flora and fauna. Typically the islands are sparsely inhabited. A number of those that we visited had no inhabitants at all except the animals. So the landings are wet landings. We were on an 85-foot, 3-masted sailing boat, which was an experience in itself for us because we had never done anything like that before. And we would go to shore in little rubber rafts like Jacques Cousteau does on his program, called Zodiacs, just like he called them. And when you get to the shore, you swing your feet over the edge and wade ashore. All of the Galapagos Islands are a national park. The Galapagos Islands are a state in the state of Ecuador, kind of like the state of Hawaii in the United States. And the whole island structure is a national park. Each trip that travels there is required to have a naturalist or an interpretive guide. Those guides are all trained by the Park Service. They're not Park Service employees like we know of as national park rangers in this country, but we happen to have a fellow who was well trained, I would say, and
bilingual, fortunately.
Bilingual, that's right. And the tourists are typically Europeans, English, French, Germans, Italians, or North Americans, and typically Canadians or Americans. And
What about the wildlife you saw there?
Yes.
the wildlife is the best part of the story. The wildlife has all come from the mainland. The theory is that the Galapagos Islands probably didn't have any large animals. The Humboldt Current comes up along the western shore of South America from the Arctic and meets a similar current coming from the north down along the coast of Costa Rica and Panama. And at the point of Ecuador, they're furthest to the west, in the Pacific Ocean, why these currents come together and then go straight west toward China, if you will. And the Galapagos Islands happens to be right in that path of current. So flotsam and jetsam and plant material and logs and stuff from storms on the coast of the mainland will float west, and they may carry plant material or small animals, and over the millions of years those things arrived at the Galapagos Islands. The trip might take 6 or 8 weeks. That is, the current moves right along, 3 or 4 knots, I think someone told me. And so on those islands are animals that are essentially imported by the current, where they're in a whole new environment, different temperature, different plant material to eat if they're animals, or different soil conditions if they're plants. And particularly interesting in the case of animals, a whole different environment in terms of predators. So animals which might be sparse on the mainland, when they happen to have the misfortune of floating on a log to the Galapagos Islands, presumably the 2 of them must have floated out there for them to make it, and they didn't have any predators there, have become very successful. It's fascinating to look at animal forms and birds which we could relate to, and I'm sure it's true with plants, but we have less technical knowledge, and so we don't relate to the plants as easily, to see how they have changed over the years with different food supply, different predator condition, different climatic conditions. It's also interesting that when human beings arrive and add domestic animals like goats or horses or cows, they quickly become dominant because there are no large animals on the Galapagos.
On that note, I have to bring the permanent conclusion. I have the signal. We're out of time. That was just flew by, and I want to say on behalf of the panel and our staff to both Judy and Steve Meyer, thank you. Every time you come, it just gets better. And ladies and gentlemen, I know you've really found this most interesting. They do such an excellent job in making us feel like we have been with them on the trip. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week, and we will discuss what we believe to be a significant issue. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.